do. I do a sort of a review. I do a review, a sort of Cliff Notes version. So I try to pre-chew things as much as I can. But with Charlotte here, that's going to help a lot because she's going to give you some concepts also. So go ahead, Charlotte, you start and then I'll jump in.
So in Nina Rudnikova's book, The Solar Way, which I'm still in the process of translating this, but it's a wonderful little book. And she was the initiator of Valentin Tomberg in Estonia into the work of the tarot. Now, she praises the Hanged Man and says this is about sacrifice. So this is the first keyword she gives us, which is also brought up by Tomberg and Mebes. And then the other subheadings she gives for the 12th arcanum are mercy, the soul of the Messiah, and the zodiac. Now, her book is called The Solar Way, and I'm sure that when you get into your explanation, you'll go into the zodiacal section, but it's quite interesting because he's taken all that content about the zodiac from the earlier work. And if you think about the book, have I got it here? The Circle of 12, yeah, which we started touching on in our chats, which they weren't public so much with the group, but this Circle of 12 and the Zodiac, this is exactly where we're at with the Hanged Man. So it's absolutely fantastic, really, that we have sequentially sort of somehow found ourselves to this point. And it's a really, like you say, this letter is incredibly profound. I mean, when I was reminding myself of all the content last night, I thought, wow, yes, this really is... because, of course, the next stage after the Hanged Man is death.
Yeah.
So when we think about the idea of sacrifice and where this letter is leading us and some of the things that Mebes, I won't go too much into Mebes because it might complicate it, but he does say something about sacrifice. I don't know if I'll be able to find it, about how to understand this letter really means to embrace the concept of sacrifice, and he's talking about the downward arc of the evolutionary cycle and the initiate basically having to sacrifice their spiritual gifts and attainments in order to help humanity. So the Hanged Man with his roots in heaven is somebody who has committed this act of sacrifice, and that's how they will begin again on the upward circle. So, but I don't want to go too much into Mebes and take away from your letter. So
yeah, so Charlotte, you can give the advanced if we get back into this on another turn, the Mebes material would just be wonderful to explore. But as we know, we've got a lot to deal with here, and with what we've done so far. But thank you for that. That's wonderful, because I always do try to come up with and only one of those that I come up with for, and that was the Zodiac. Did I come up for this letter? But sacrifice, yes. And I was thinking, I try to come up with a sort of an overall concept that Tomberg seems to be moving towards, and the one I came up with for this one was authentic faith. So that's a bit vague, but I'm calling it what it is: authentic faith, and the theme of the truly human man. So of course, that interweaves with the man of sacrifice. And
gravitation, of course, he makes a lot of the idea of gravitation, because one of the anecdotes he will give is about the Christ walking on the water. So I think that's also quite an important thing for him in that letter. But I do think it's quite interesting, that letter, because in the first half, he's got his own very Christian interpretation of the letter on it, which is the unique insights that he brings to the tarot work. But then in the second half of that letter, he goes more into the zodiac, and I found that, because of the historical side of it, with Mebes and Nina, I just found that very interesting, how far he'd reconnected with them in that second part. So you kind of have the best of both worlds there with his letter.
And he also seems to me to explore the two paths of the Platonic and the Aristotelian, the empirical, the empirical man and the theologian, as an example. But I'm jumping ahead. So let me start. I'm really gonna try to not get bogged in the weeds here. It's hard. So it is going to presume that you are familiar already with some of these concepts. So I'm just going to give you my first impressions because like I said, I think it's a good idea to just meditate on the image first and see what comes to you before you start. So and it was interesting to compare it later after I read it, how they aligned. My first impressions are this is a disturbing image of a man hung upside down by one foot. To me, that's automatically a disorienting image. The starkness then of the two tree trunks, that was the next thing that struck me, which have had their life-giving branches cropped tight to the trunk, though they both still seem to be planted in two hummocks in the ground. The truncated, I was thinking of the truncated tree of life, but later I find out it's about the 12 branches being cut to the trunk. It's more about that. Then the third impression I had was that I see flames. So I see the man's hair looks like an upside down fire, and the notches on the trees are flame-like in shape, and the bases of the trees seem to have flames licking at them. Um, so that was something that also gets brought up later with the heart, and the heart being, there's a Jean Arp poem that I love, which said, "My heart is a flame turned upside down." And so I love that line. No, next I saw an odd symmetry which leaps out as the image could be folded along a vertical midline, and it would be perfectly symmetrical and present a perfect mirrored image, except for the bent knee and the leg folding across the midline. This disrupts the symmetry and contributes to its unsettling impression, because otherwise it's a rather symmetrical image. And so that unsettled me. So then the next thing I noticed was the stoicism of the face, the look of resignation and powerlessness in the face, but also calm. Then I thought, well, it reminds me of a yoga posture. It reminded me of an inversion, either like tree pose, upside down, headstand and handstand, but without using the hands. So those were my initial impressions. So that's why I take off from. As Charlotte mentioned, Tomberg first launches into gravitation and talking about the different spheres of gravitation. Then in the later part, he goes into breaking this down with the entire theory about the zodiac, which was fascinating to me to break that down through numerology from the numbers of the 12, the 4, the 3, and the 1. Again, he's creating these systems. And I was also fascinated by his listing of the 7 enigmas, the 7 enigmas of the world. All these things are just, our entire discussions get launched around these centers. He creates centers of gravity within this one letter, that you have to sort of go into the orbit of that discussion. And it's very cosmic, it's very far reaching. So, and yet very personal, because he brings it back to the heart and to Christ, and it's beautiful. So back to the problem of gravitation, the relationship between man and gravitation. The gravitation is, he calls it a regulating factor in the macrocosm and the microcosm. So our placement in the cosmic gravitational system, we have a physical gravitation towards, from the planet around the sun and our bodies on the planet. And then there's the gravitation of a spiritual order, which determines, he says, our freedom and our domain of movement through the realms, which surround God as the center. The God is the center of this particular cosmos. So we have the 2 centers of gravity that he starts with, which is paradise, God, the center of which is God, and the heavenly kingdom. And then, so that's the kingdom of God here. Then there's the kingdom of the prince of this world. So there's the kingdom of Terra, which is the realm of the serpent. These 2 spheres attract. So one is attractive towards the earth elements, the prince of this world and the systems of this world. And the other one is we're attracted upward, hence the hanged man upside down is standing on a ground of heaven, attracted to the sphere of paradise and God. So that's the basic premise. Then he goes into the Manichaean fallacy about that everything spiritual, everything in the spirit is in the invisible world is good, and everything in nature is in the visible world is bad. But he says, of course, that's way oversimplified, but that the visible world and the invisible world intersect. You can imagine them as these two circles, and that in that intersection is the moral life, the moral world, the moral world. That's kind of an important principle. Moral discernment is what will guides us to navigate through the phenomena of nature, such as an example is determining the choice of remedies within the kingdom of nature. So you can either go with like an entirely man-made remedy for something, which is concocted out of a test tubes and that sort of thing, or you can go and find plants and find out how a naturopathic remedy, how nature speaks to you about natural healing. That's just one example of this, using our discernment, using moral discernment. I used Charlotte's phrase that she often uses, which is balancing the binaries here. So there are opposing desires. We have the gravitational pull upward as spiritual men and women, and we have the carnal draw of the lower spheres towards our bodies and what the bodies need on this earth, the carnal man. So we have the carnal man and the spiritual man, and in the middle is psychic man. So there are these gradations, and psychic man is where there can be a lot of, let's just say, a lot of obfuscation. There can be a lot of confusion, and this is where freedom of choice and free will comes in, because we do have to make decisions in this realm to gravitate towards one realm or the other. So there's attraction from above, and and then this mentions, the first time mentions benefaction and martyrdom, which gets to what Charlotte was saying about sacrifice. So there's a hint of that right away, saying that the hangman represents, so that attraction from above is a benefaction, but it's also a martyrdom, and it's essentially solitary. It's a solitary state, and goes on into talking about the desert fathers who sought and created solitary environments in order to hold a spiritual atmosphere in which they could breathe. That they could breathe in the spiritual atmosphere of solitude. It was conducive to their rather interior world, their interior vigil, where they're doing their inner exploration of what the Hermeticists would call the depths and the heights. So the body, as well, is subject to the attraction of heaven. So he talks about the raptures of Teresa of Avila, the rapture of her body and soul, and the physical levitation. Okay, he goes into that quite a bit, and then Teresa is throughout this. He uses her as sort of his poster girl to help illustrate the hangman, and then he goes into the discussion, as Charlotte pointed out, the Christian angle of the formula around I am. He mentions the 7 I ams, the formula of revelation in the world, of the existence of the divine essence of Jesus Christ, which reveals itself through the I am. The 7 I ams is a gradual revelation, where Jesus invites Peter to walk on the water and says, I am, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. I am gravitation. He who holds to me will never sink or be engulfed. So Jesus is presenting the attraction. He's trying to create that attraction around the center of gravitation of the divine I am. So where man struggles is with the fear of elemental forces of gravitation of a lower order. And this is the terrestrial field of electricity, which is always agitated, full of drama. It's the field of death. So this is a foreshadowing of the next letter, death. This is a quick taste of that. The field of death. So transcendence of the elements of this world points to the immortality of the soul, as well as the way to the kingdom of heaven. So angels always preface their greetings to mortals by saying, be not afraid. I think that's interesting. Be not afraid. That's what Jesus says to Peter, be not afraid. I am, be not afraid, come and join me. So he goes back into the psychosomatic ecstasy of Peter walking on the water as a psychosomatic ecstasy, and then Teresa being levitated out of her body. And he contracts ecstasy with ecstasy, which is the centering of the self. So we can either go out of ourselves into a centrifugal, a force that takes us outward, and that can drive us towards heaven. But we also can go inward into ecstasy, which is the centering of the self, and also center in the divine within. So the I am is the divine I of the Son of the Eternal Father, present in itself, ego sum noli te timere. So do not be afraid, for I am. Lo, I am with you always until the end of the world. He quotes that line from Jesus, and that's one of my very favorite lines. I find myself coming back to that line over and over again. Lo, I am with you always until the end of the world. So now, just as the physical sun attracts the planets in the gravitational field in the physical cosmos, the cosmology of the I am revolves around the true sun, which we'd call the invisible sun, the central sun, which is the center of a celestial gravitational field, which attracts other beings to its center of celestial gravitation. So we have these intersecting worlds, the invisible and the visible and invisible. So the aim of the I am, the aim of Jesus Christ as an essence walking on the water, points to the way that we must try to tread the state of ecstasy, absolute centeredness, moving through this world, in this world, but not of this world. So the walking on the water is a perfect illustration of that, moving through the world, in this world, but not of this world. So he goes into the 3 types of levitation. I'm not going to go into that because some of it is from the psychic realm, that middle realm we talked about between the spiritual man and the carnal man. There is this astral realm, this realm of spiritualism. And he goes off into this a lot because he had to talk about the occult realities of people he knew that were doing, practicing occult practices where they would levitate themselves, or doing psychic things, moving things, with their minds. But he distinguishes between that repelling action of the self-willed levitation is a repelling action. It's in the field of the electrical, and hence it takes massive effort and concentration to sustain this levitation, as opposed to the raptures of Teresa, which just seem to be that gravitation from above, where she's just kind of pulled heavenward, and is taken aloft. So he distinguishes between those things. I don't want to go there very much because it just goes on. Serpent power, Kundalini, yogic powers. He goes off on these tangents about that. It really just pulls it all in for some of us. That we have touched on these things, but sometimes it can be bewildering when he goes into the chakra systems, things like this. The things that are pulled from the Hindu, the Rig Vedas, and such. But just hold on for the ride because it all comes back together. So the terrestrial gravitation is what determines the evolution of all earthly life. And he brings up the concept of enfoldment, coagulation, that the center of gravity around which the earth, the nation, the tribe, the organism is an enfoldment. It tends to contract, it tends to enfold, and tends to shrink down, and become quite fixed. So versus the celestial gravitation, which being heavenly is based on radiation. It's the evolution of the spiritual life, and its themes are extension, expansion, rising upwards. And there's an absolute center of gravitation there, which draws it as just as powerfully as terrestrial gravitation and enfoldment. Again, humans are pulled between these two, and we're always struggling with that. That's one of our essential struggles, is which in which direction, and how do we balance these forces, these tremendous forces. So the world is divided. Is everyone still okay with this? I'm getting there. Does anybody have any questions right now? So far, no questions? I hope not, because I have a lot more to say. So the world is divided into those who worship the Gibor, the Superman, okay, the manifestation of beings endowed with great power. These are terrestrial beings who have a great force of enfoldment. They have galvanized the powers of enfoldment around themselves. And then there's those who love the tzaddik, the righteous man, who radiates and rises towards the spiritual center of gravitation. So the ideal around enfoldment is the flesh, and it pushes mankind towards things, ideals like possession, power, enjoyment. Those are completely legitimate within the earthly sphere. These are more gravitating around this center of gravity, which actually tends to be, as we would say, more selfish, around the earthly self, the flesh self. Okay, then that is compared and contrasted to the ideal of radiation, which is represented by the spirit. And he goes now back to the idea of poverty, chastity, and obedience being the essence of the essential principles of this radiation, the center of gravitation, which is radiation. So you'll see the repeating themes. The righteous man, the tzaddik, is the hanged man, with whom the hermeticist must resolutely align himself. He is not a grand master or an archmage or an adept. He doesn't have great power in himself, but it represents, so not a top-down teaching from a teacher, a guru, etc. But the hermeticist must embrace the idea of learning from everyone instead of teaching everyone. Okay, it's sort of it's a sort of a philosophical bent one tries to cultivate, learning from everyone rather than teaching everyone. We must see clearly with the will. Then he really launches heavily in heavy discussion about the will, the state of being suspended and upside down. Is a crucifixion of the spiritual man. Hence, Jesus sacrificed in crucifixion is represented here. And when you're in a state of crucifixion and you're hung upside down like this, there is no comfort coming to you from, you are suspended. There's no comfort from the heavens and there's no comfort from the earth. So you are suspended in this very strange liminal space. So this is the experience of complete solitude of the soul. And this extreme loneliness, which is this state. It's beyond ordinary solitude in the world. It's the solitude of being outside of the world. You're outside of the world, both celestial and terrestrial. So this is represented by Jesus's state, his existence in the world and his transitioning through this world. So there's this 0 point of suspension of the soul between the celestial, terrestrial, and terrestrial gravitational fields. It's certainly the place of the soul's permanent sojourn. That's an interesting idea. 0 point. This is the place of the soul's permanent sojourn. Its place in the desert. It's between these two worlds. So we go back to the idea of being upside down. The solid ground is represented by the beam that he's hanging from in heavenward. His grounding is standing in heavenward. There was a passage I'll get to. Yes. So there's a wonderful passage. I'm just going to read really quickly because it was just so beautiful. the will. Okay, wait, was it there? Was it there? Was it there? This quote. So this is from Saint Teresa, where she says, "The will must be fully occupied in loving, but does not understand how it loves. If it understands, it does not understand how it understands, or at least cannot comprehend anything of what it understands. I do not think that it understands at all, because, as I have said, it does not understand itself. Nor can I myself understand this. Let it be observed, too, that however long the soul may enjoy this suspension of the faculties, the actual time is, in my opinion, very short. Half an hour would be very long period of a rapture. Longer, I think, than any I have ever experienced. Actually, it is very difficult to judge the time since the senses are in abeyance. But I do not think that it can ever be long before one of them recovers. It is the will that maintains the contact, but the other two faculties soon begin to trouble it once more. But as the will is calm, they become suspended again, and they are quiet for a little longer. But eventually, they spring into life again. And the final thing she says here is so beautiful. For once the two faculties have begun to grow drunk on the taste of this wine, they are ready to give themselves up again in order to enjoy more. Then they keep company with the will, and the three rejoice together. They keep company with the will, and the three rejoice together. That is a very beautiful expression. Um, and so then he goes in to apply this to practical Hermeticism. The practical Hermeticism, therefore, and this is a quote from Tomberg, applies to itself to educating thought and imagination or memory to keep in step with the will. This is why it requires constant effort of thought and imagination, combined in order to think, meditate, and contemplate in symbols. Symbolism being the sole means of rendering thought and imagination capable of not being suspended when the will submits to revelation from above and enabling them to unite with it in its act of receptive obedience, so that the soul not only has a revelation of faith, but also participates in this revelation with its understanding and memory. So that's a very important that's a very important passage. I felt it points to the attitude of obedience, the receptive obedience he describes. Um, you know, the obedience of Mary, thy will be done through, thy will be done through me, Lord. Be it as according to thy will. Jesus saying, obviously the ultimate sacrifice towards this divine center of gravity, towards the will of the divine will, and that sacrifice and attitude of receptive obedience. So he goes on to talk about the three, what is it, he goes, the refrain of Tomberg on page 319, he goes back to the refrain of he describes her Teresa's experience as the hermetic totality of her experience is union, which is mysticism, knowledge, gnosis, and future realization, which is divine magic. The concept of future realization becomes interesting and important because it has to do with staying open to the future man, the future of mankind, and staying open and ever hopeful towards the attitude of being hopeful towards the future of mankind. So he goes on to reiterate that Hermeticism is experiential, not analytical. Not analytical, which is where I just read from that. How about it's about the experience from above, and it's experiential. Then this is where I think it goes into, he talks about authentic hermeticists vis-a-vis theologians and scientists, and he compares theologians and scientists, and I thought it was pretty funny, actually, the way he blasts the theologian Cardinal Cardinal Louis Biot, where basically he just is a devastating criticism of the theologian who seems like a humble person, seems they appear as modest, but then they have this absolute certainty. They go into this absolute place of absolute certainty, which leads them into a certain attitude that Tomberg finds intolerable, where he says, where, for instance, on the subject of the eternal nature of the soul, or the soul and what happens to it before death and after death. And so when the body dies, he says, this is ridiculous. The body dying, the soul at the instant of death is thus made to depart like a rocket with a prefixed program, a preset rocket program for eternity, which is him sort of poking fun at this previous paragraph, which I assume you read. I won't go there any further, but it's very funny. To me, this is where he does divide. He divides the field into what I would call the spheres of exploration: the Aristotelian, the empirical route, and the Platonic, or the route of working through absolute ideals and absolute truths. He then, and this is something that I'm thinking that Charlotte will help us with, but this will probably be crystallized. This will probably be brought up more later. But I love the phrase that the empirical scientist starts from the position of ignoramus et ignorabimus, which is we do not know and we shall never know, with regard to the seven enigmas. And the seven enigmas are on page 321. If you didn't read those, they quickly are, for the sake of the video. The essence of number one, the essence of matter and energy. Number two, the origin of motion. Number three, the origin of the senses, sense perception. The question of free will, number four. Five, the origin of life. Six, the purposeful organization of nature. Seven, the origin of thought and language. Okay, and so these are called the seven enigmas. So there's then he goes on to talk about, so that absolute certainty. He considers the position of absolute certainty of the theologian to be basically not going in the right direction, really. And the empirical scientist, basically skeptical that you can ever know anything, absolutely ever. We do not know and we shall never know. He doesn't think that that's really necessarily, although it's a more humble position, it's not going to lead you terribly far either. So he goes into offering a third way, the way of the third possibility, the way of reconciliation, which is the way of staying open to the future man. I really love this. And his possibilities, the future man. Let me just see something here. Okay. So the future man, we have to be open to our own limited views and fallibility. So while we still assert that there are certain truths that are, for instance, the existence of freedom. Tomberg asserts that you can start from precepts like that, but then you have to be very careful when you start to make absolute statements about anything. But he's laying out the path of staying flexible in your soul and open to the possibility of a future man who has a different level of consciousness altogether than what we hold now. And that, he says, is that's where the moral sphere comes in, moral logic. And this is my very favorite part of where Tomberg explores deeply the idea of moral warmth and replacing formal logic with moral logic, which exudes a warmth, a solar warmth, as opposed to cold thought, formal logic, intellectualizing of the imagination through just cold thinking. So he calls this work of the imagination, he calls it exact imagination. Then you have to go back to the magician again, as I was saying here, because he starts talking about the arcanum of intellectual geniality, consciousness, concentration without effort, synthesis of the conscious and the unconscious. So you go back to page 20 to review the magician, which talks about those concepts. If you find yourself stumbling here because he's applying those precepts here, and how they're going to play out now. He goes into Caiaphas's argument as a classic example of a formal form of logic, the cold thinking of that, which is where the part is not as great as the whole, and that there needs to be sacrifice of the part in order to save the whole, which goes back to quantitative principles. Again, here's another one of those axioms where quantitative versus qualitative principles. You may need to go back and review those ideas. Again, most of those are in the first 3 arcana. Covers a lot of that territory. So mastering these axioms and principles, you can see, of the Hermetic philosophy, they become more and more important so that we can go deeply into these letters. So moral logic introduces warmth into the light of thought and makes it solar instead of lunar or cold. This is done through the crucial element of symbolism becomes very important here. Simultaneously, imagination and logical thinking become a synthesis. Then he goes into the zodiacalization of the will, and this is where it goes. He starts to launch into the man of the zodiac. I don't want to go too deeply into this right now. We can go more granular with this later. But this is the means by which the soul voluntarily sacrifices its powers to the heavens. The soul, being a macrocosmic correlate of the macrocosm, is symbolized through the 12 elements of the zodiac, and the hangman actually becomes the 13th. The hangman is the 13th, which is the letter 13, another foreshadowing of the death card. So that points to sacrifice. And so this becomes really important. The zodiac is just a fascinating thing, and it may require you to read this section. I recommend that you read this a couple times. What pages are these now that we're on? We're on page 325. On page 325, there's he goes into breaking down the significance of the letter of the number 12. You know that he always does this. He goes into the numerology of the letter at some point and draws that into the bigger picture. In this case, the number 12 is very significant, as Charlotte pointed out. The zodiac there are 12 in number, the 12 aspects of the will of God. There are 12 channels of the will of God represented in the zodiac. Then that is broken down into the quaternary of the elements, which are then they're the forces of the Trinity forces of 3 act on the quaternary forces, and it all reduces down to the monad of the 1. So the numbers are 12, 4, 3, and 1. Again, these are the kind of things he'll come back to. You'll come back to again and again. But it's good to take note and maybe earmark that page. Is very important to go back to learn these precepts of what he's going to be talking about when he is talking about the hangman being swallowed up by the zodiac. So if you don't understand what that phrase means, be patient with yourself, because it's an awful lot to take in. The hangman is zodiacalized. And so he points out that the 2 tree trunks in the image with the truncated branches those are the 12 aspects of the zodiac, and that the hangman, they're truncated, they're cut to the trunk, means that the hangman has overcome or swallowed, absorbed, or transcended the 12 aspects of the zodiac, the 12 facets of the divine will, and he's internalized them, and so he becomes the 13th. He becomes the 13th, which has transcended the 12. So this is where he brings up authentic faith. And there was a beautiful quote again. After the Song of Creation, which is just so beautiful here, from the Vedic hymns, from the Rig Veda. And that's on 327. That bears reading a couple of times. His commentary on that, about what the Hindu soul felt one starry night, in beholding the universe. In this profound sphere, so he's going back into the hangman. The hangman participates through his will. He is found suspended between the potential and the real. And it is the potential which is more real for him than the real, properly said. He lives by authentic faith, what the Hermetic book of Corey Cosmu designates as the gift of black perfection, or the gift of perfect night, the gift of perfect certainty drawn from the night of ultra luminous darkness. For there is darkness, small d, and darkness with a capital D. The former is that of ignorance and blindness. The latter is that of knowledge going beyond natural human cognitive powers. It reveals itself to intuitive seeing. So that goes on. That you'll recognize the idea of the perfect night, the perfect darkness. If you experience St. John of the Cross at all, the mystics, they often touch on this perfect night, this perfect darkness, or the cloud of unknowing. I think that's what that's talking about. So then onward, and I am almost done here. Thank goodness, thank goodness. Uh, so again, this is where authentic faith, which represents a certain absolute certainty, and he talks about the roots of Hermeticism through the living tradition of that this is a legacy that comes to us. That it's generation upon generation, building from the Egyptians through the Israelites, through Christendom, and there's a continuity of this tradition. So that's very important. This continuity of tradition. It's very important to the Hermeticist to always be grounded in this. Then he goes on to talk about the quality of sainthood, since he's quoted from the saints so much. Is the Hermeticist to try to take in to try to send all of his centers of his being heavenward? Is that what he's really meant to do, to sublimate heavenward? And he says the Hermeticist is not. That's not the destination of a Hermeticist, who is here to actually experience some of the centers being active, but always in touch. The centers are always still in touch with the human and human initiatory action, the human as the initiator. Very important. So the Hermeticist is truly a bridge. He acts as a bridge between the divine realm. So he's not going to be a Saint Teresa going up into the rapture. Okay, that's not what we are here to do as Hermeticists, but we are here to build these bridges. He goes into the fire of Emmaus. He talks about the importance of the heart. And this is the heart of the whole matter. Of course, he goes into it at the very end, where he talks about the fire of Emmaus, which is that walk on the beach where the disciples were walking with Jesus and recognize him with their heart. They recognize finally that he is the one. Even though their visible eyes didn't recognize the one, their hearts did, which is that cardial perception that we've talked about so much here. We talk about that all the time. And this brings it to the hangman, where to me, it's like the head being down at the bottom. Above his head is the cardial awareness that is it's the metanoia, the greater mind, which surrounds the entire of our beings. The greatest journey being, so our practices are always to bring the head, the cognitive function, down into the heart, right? Through these practices. The longest journey is from the head to the heart, that old saying. And so that's what he's displaying here. So the heart is that flame on his head. I realized that's the flame on his head. That's the heart being one with the head, or even superseding the head. So you're combining the imperceptible and perceptible light, the burning fire of the heart, the truly human man. And he compares that, draws that back to the Old Testament, calling the truly human man is represented by the eternal Job, which is just wonderful, because who doesn't identify with Job? Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Can I jump in and just make a comment about a couple of things? As you know, I'm working, but I'm trying to keep an eye on both things going on. When you mentioned symbolism, that's for me a really key part of this. And I just want, if you don't mind, to read a little passage, which is on the PDF, it's page 319. I'm not quite sure about the book, but from the bottom of my online text here, he says, practical Hermeticism therefore applies itself to educating thought and imagination or memory to keep in step with the will. This is why it requires constant effort of thought and imagination combined in order to think, meditate, and contemplate in symbols. Symbolism being the sole means of rendering thought and imagination capable of not being suspended when the will submits to revelation from above, and enabling them to unite with it in its act of receptive obedience, so that the soul not only has a revelation of faith, but also participates in this revelation with its understanding and memory. That's what you need to attain the gift of Black perfection. That's the state of being suspended, receiving the revelation from above, but because the whole being would be absorbed in just receiving and witnessing such an influx, it's only the symbol that will remain in the mind. And then after the event of the revelation, when you come to think about it, it's the symbol that you would use to penetrate and to open the door to understanding the revelation that was received. So for me, that's one of those instances where I feel like Tomberg really manages to encapsulate something so profoundly spiritual that it's kind of almost amazing that he manages to put it into words. And I think that's just a wonderful passage, and also explains the whole point of the tarot, because obviously the tarot images are all perfect symbols. And it's by going deeper into those symbols that we are enabled to understand the revelation. So that was one thing you mentioned that was, I think, really, really important. The other one, so the Latin maxim, ignoramus e ignorabimus. So he actually gets that from Shmakov. Well, that's, I think, where he will have got it from. So I'm not sure if people will recall, but he does, Tomberg in Meditation on the Tarot does refer to certain members of the St. Petersburg school who'd before him written other great works on tarot and the occult, Mebes, Nina Rudnikova, and one of them is the engineer Shmakov, who's written this incredible book about the tarot, a huge, great, very, very complicated tome. But he says quite a lot about this Latin maxim. I mean, I've got some quotes here, but I think they're so complex. I mean, he just defines it as we do not know and we will not know. And it represents the idea that scientific knowledge is limited, which you went into this in your talk. So, I mean, I think there's more that could be said about it, but it's maybe not essential. That might be for another time. I just thought it would be interesting to note that where he picks this term up from is from Shmakov, and he goes into the divine mind and the small mind and how you can switch between the two forms of lesser and greater ignorance, I think could be said. So
there's the ignorance of the cloud of unknowing, and then there's ignorance in the field of the empirical scientists. So there's these different levels of ignorance, capital I, small I.
Yeah, what does he say here? He says, so turning to the question of the possibility of knowing the factors that lie in the external world, we see that they can be divided into two groups, ignoramus and ignorabibus. The group of objects ignoramus is that which is directly cognizable and is related to the existing composition. The ignorabimus group is that which cannot be known a priori by consciousness in its present state of development. I mean, as you can imagine, it gets more and more complicated. He goes very philosophically into those terms. And I think it would be a bit too much detail about just that, but
yeah,
it just jumped out because it's obviously a very recognizable phrase. So I just noticed that. But I think certainly the symbolism bit is a key in this card.
That was a key passage you read. I'm glad you read that passage, because that was just absolutely key. That bears deep study, that passage on 319 about practical Hermeticism. So I want to just, if you don't, I'm sorry to interrupt, Charlotte. I just, before because we're going to run out of time soon, I wanted to open the floor to you guys. Hello, Mark. Good to see you. Hi there. I want to open the floor to ask you if there's any places where you had questions that we might go towards that interest you here. And how do you feel about this whole overall? Or tell us how you're feeling. John.
Well, first of all, thank you, both Alice and Charlotte, for what you have already said. The thing that really hit me was the same thing that hit me in the Arcanum on the Pope. And the Tomberg says, before you start trying to interpret anything, just remember the Pope, the Hierophant, has got his hand outstretched in blessing. And it's about blessing if it's nothing else. And at the beginning of this letter, Tomberg talks about the hanged man actually being drawn by the, is it by the radiance of God or the attraction of God? So it isn't simply a poor chap who's in a horrible position. It's a poor chap who, like the Desert Fathers, has been attracted into this because it is so exciting what he's doing. And I'm a little bit sorry we didn't talk more about the two branches on either side being the tree of life. Because the tree of life is upside down, just as the hanged man is upside down. And actually, both are receiving their life and attraction and glory from what is above. So yes, it is uncomfortable because as well as being attracted by the source above, we are also being attracted by all sorts of rather nastier things underneath. And that is painful, but it is wonderful, I think, to actually see it in the basic context of the hanged man is there, at least in part because he has been drawn like the Desert Fathers by the attractiveness of God. Thank you.
You're right there, and he is actually the middle pillar of the tree of life. He's got that whole line that goes through the middle, so that's another another discussion. But yeah, you're completely right about that. And yeah, and he does make a great distinction as well between the attraction and the radiance and the different sorts of levitation, the ultimate example of which would be a witch's broomstick, and the black magical forms of levitation. So I think, and which are kind of electrical in nature. So I think that's quite interesting as well.
Anybody else I want to get the feeling for where you are with this text.
I'll say something just because I'm new. So, and see if this fits in anywhere. I was struck, obviously, between the pull of the transcendental and spiritual and the empirical and material, and then particularly, and the space in between the two is freedom. And that sounded very existential to me. And that struck a chord personally. So I tried to stick with something. I had all these notes that like, oh, I need to learn that. And then when I thought of Jesus walking on water in his profound centering, and Abraham, setting out, walking across the desert, essentially in faith, right? But in both cases, they led with their feet. And when I think part of my personal spirituality is that existential idea that meaning is made, is created. At least that's the way we jump-start it, right? And that they were doing this. And then I just pulled in, because as you all know, an interact of love accomplishes the center, which the will gravitates and empowers us to walk, to act, to choose. This was useful for me because I'm not, when I do got a lot of Buddhist meditation experience, all of you know, when you start to meditate, the first thing you notice are your thoughts, and then the thoughts engender the feelings come in their wake, and then the action, if there is any. But this was again seemed kind of existential, that love and our willing connection to love is what jump starts. And to me, this was like a flip. This is why the feet are on the top. And Jesus and Abraham walked that everything they did in response to God, so that in God's will. And so that was love. So anyway, that I just thought I'd throw that out. Is that, and see if that rung true.
Lovely information. I'm glad you pointed that out about the active agency of love in working with will. It's crucial. And it's also, to me, what led me to Tomberg, that warmth, that warm light,
Yeah.
that solar
Yeah.
love that emanates out of all of this teaching. You know, his love of wanting to share these teachings amongst, you know, not teaching top down, but learning from everyone. And that's why it's such a rich text, because he's pulling in things from everyone, isn't he? I mean, true Hermeticist. He's just, you know, he's like a crow who goes around, picks up any shiny object, brings it to the nest, and then says, now here's the heart of it. Let's take the heart of these shiny things and figure out what it is. What do you have? What do we have that's in alignment with our faith that we can?
That. Yeah. That's why it's so exciting, because it kind of reminds you and reinvigorates you of your faith.
What else, guys? Haven't seen you all summer. What do you? Where are you with this? This is exciting. It's exciting. We're in the second half.
You know, one sentence in all of this that just stood out to me, and it sort of goes with what Pam was saying, because I like to look at this of, okay, what does this mean to me in terms of my walk, my living? And it was this statement of the history of the human race since the fall is the prodigal son, freedom to leave the father's house and the freedom to return. So that core freedom, but it's a freedom to return as well. And that may be a daily return for me, but it's that space of freedom. That was central for me in this as well. Thank you.
When Charlotte points out it struck me when she points out the position of the hangman upside down. Remember the wheel, the card about the wheel, where there's the monkey and the man, right? One's representing involution, that fall, the fall from paradise, and that we have free will to begin the return. So here is the man in full free fall, in involution, right? Charlotte highlighted that. And so it works with the wheel card too. So go back and look at that. Wheel of Fortune or whatever it was called. I forget, the Wheel of Fortune card, right? Yeah. These things, these symbols, they become shorthand. It's really important, the symbolism, beginning to integrate the symbolism into your heart, because it becomes shorthand, so that there's no need for a lot of verbal explanation of this stuff. No cogitation is needed. You just need to, if you can embrace the symbols and hold them together in your greater mind, they start to speak with each other, and they start to speak through you, through your all of your levels of being, your feeling, your will, and your mind, and your brain function. Because that's why, Tomberg, this is such a challenging text for you all, because it has to be experienced, it has to be lived. So don't be impatient with yourself if some of this is not taking, because you need to chew it for quite a while before it becomes internalized, experiential. Where are you coming from, Mark? What's up with you?
I don't know if I'm coming or going. Yeah, I'm coming out of a busy season and moving into what is feeling equally busy. just started in the past month. I'm participating in the Living School at the Center for Action and Contemplation. And I was surprised to discover some synchronicity in this reading, and with just the teaching that I've been exposed to there. And there was some overlap with the Desert Fathers, which was just an exciting place to intersect with this study. I think one of the things that is intrigued me about this image, and there's all this talk about the gravitation from above and the heavenly and spiritual realm. Yet the foot is still bound. He's still suspended. It's not exactly levitation that this hanged man is pulling off. And one of the things that I keep asking myself and wondering about is his hands, which aren't visible to us. And I suspect that if we were to move around and view him from the backside, that we would discover that his hands aren't bound. That seems to be this this invitation to acceptance, and maybe that's a piece of the sacrifice that's being made here. But those are some of the places that my mind has been just in this reading, and examining and meditating on the image is, you know, in what way am I willing to place myself in this similar position, recognizing that I am not capable of suspending myself in this place in which I'm attracted to the heavens, but I'm certainly subject to the gravitation of just the demands and desires that this earthly life has placed upon me as well. Yet am I willing to just remain submissive with my hands behind my back, not attempting to free myself from this place that maybe I'm feeling like I'm hanging in. So yeah, glad to see you all, and look forward to exploring this stuff with you. Thanks.
That's a great thing you pointed out about the hands. Now, I just want to put out the question here to you all. What difference would it make to you if his hands were bound or unbound? We don't know. We know the foot is bound. We don't know whether his hands are bound. What difference does that make? Mark encountered them symbolically as unbound.
Yeah, it seems like they have to be unbound. Otherwise you can't work. You can't create. That seems like the right appropriate symbol. And when he said that, I thought, yeah, I thought that, because if his hands were bound, he wouldn't have the power to gravitate to love and to act in that, and to act with open hands. So
He wouldn't have free will. He wouldn't have free will.
Sorry?
He wouldn't have free will because he would be coerced by being bound completely.
Absolutely.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I'm so grateful to Mark for that, because it's brought me back to the arcanum of the emperor, who is deliberately positioned so he can't actually jump up and run or get up and do something about it. But that wouldn't work if he was tied. He is in this position because he has chosen to be, as it were, entirely receptive, to God. So that really makes a deal of sense. Thank you.
Thank you also, John, for that, because that brings back the image again of the emperor with his legs are in a similar configuration in a 4. One leg bent like a 4, one leg is bent, and he's leaning back. And so he's also supported by something external. In this case, it's a rope suspended, but in that case, he's standing and not moving. Wonderful correlation. Thank you.
Yes, and I think the position of the legs, I was also thinking of the emperor and the hand position, but also the leg position. I think in the case of the hangman, there might be a link with the descending triangle, which is considered the kind of ultimate symbol of the Hermetic path. I can look more into that lately. That's again something from Meaves, but it's to do with the downward pointing triangle, and I think that might also be relevant here with the hangman card.
Yes, I was wondering.
I was also looking through my books when Mark was speaking, because I remember reading something about the hands and the position of the hands. I just can't remember where, but I will have a look for that reference and see if I can shed more light on it, because I also think it's significant. So if I manage to find out where I read that, I'll let you know.
So it is so important to meditate on these cards yourself, because don't underestimate your own powers of observation and bringing things to the forefront that even Tomberg overlooked. Like I meditated on one of these cards with the emperor, and I focused on the mantle and the chain around the talisman around his neck, which Tomberg didn't talk about at all. I had an entire meditation that was very fruitful on just that subject. So allow your own imagination to play here, because it's in allowing your imagination to play with the symbols. You're not going to make it pedantic. You're not going to follow any one guru, any one teacher. Tomberg wants you to think for yourself and learn on your own.
I have a comment.
Hi, honey.
Hi. When I turned the book, the page of the photo of the hanged man on 305 upside down, he doesn't look in this rendition, does not look in super distress. He does not look in distress at all to me. I was focusing on the hands, as Mark pointed out, but if you look closely, the rope is not adhered to his leg. It's not. It looks almost like he's jumping, and the one so it looks completely different upside down to me. Now, the one comment that I had, the one sentence that jumped out at me was very hopeful. And it was when you, Alice, were talking about moral logic, and you said that's the future of man's consciousness. Well, when I think of that, the future of man's consciousness, because we know that we are already more conscious, aware than we were 25 years ago or 125 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. That's just the way that our brain has evolved. But when you look at this hanged man upside down, I mean right side up, where his feet are down and his head is up, it looks completely different to me, completely different. As I said, the rope does not attach to his leg. Thank you.
So you've looked at the symbol, completely flipped it. And if you were just using the tarot deck, as I have, I've worked with just tarot. You are reading, some cards are upright, and when you lay them on a table, sometimes they go into reverse. They're read upside down. And so that's a whole different interpretation. fascinating. Thanks for pointing that out, because that's another rich angle towards symbols, and none of it's wrong and none of it's right. It's just that approach to symbolism that's so deep and rich.
And that also taps into the idea of freedom, which some of you have mentioned. And this puts me in a mind of a quote from Ouspensky in his own book about the tarot. And these are some of the little insights that he had about the Hanged Man. He chose this way himself. For this, he went over a long road from trial to trial, from initiation to initiation, through failures and falls. And now he has found the truth and knows himself. And I think that's what gives him this inner radiation, which does indeed make him appear as if he's floating and being drawn upwards, rather than, even though I think the sacrifice element is important and that's one side of it, it's at least as important to realize that he chose this path and that's what he's walking, and that's being a free, an act of free will. So ultimately, of course, the suffering is transcended.
So wonderful. This has been so rich. I'm mindful of the time. We've gone a quarter hour past what we usually do, but it usually takes about an hour and a quarter to get to this place. Are we okay? Should we wrap this up now? Anything hanging from the Hanged Man that you want? Any hanging chads or things? Hangnails? Anything? I guess we're done today. That's great. That's wonderful. So anybody wants to stay after and talk to me, I would love to stay and talk for a little while, because I'd love to catch up with you all and find out what's going on with you.